A few months ago, I posted a video devoted to the Toccata in E minor, BWV 914 by Johann Sebastian Bach. In this video, I want to look at another toccata in E minor by Bach. In this instance, not an independent work, but rather the first movement of the sixth Partita, BWV 830. The two E minor toccatas contain some fundamental differences. The toccata BWV 914 is included nowadays in a group of 7 toccatas spanning the BWV numbers 910 to 916. It is important to point out that Bach never conceived of these 7 toccatas as a group. However, all of them are early works since they were composed before 1715, and while they're very different from one another, they do share a common approach to the toccata genre. They're multi-sectional works that alternate between freer, improvisatory-like sections and stricter, imitative or fugal sections. On the other hand, the sixth Partita was first published in 1730, and even if it already appears in an earlier form in the Klavierbüchlein für Anna Magdalena Bach of 1725, we are still dealing with a much later work. Significantly, the six partitas were Bach's first published compositions, his Opus 1. They were published individually between 1726 and 1730, and in 1731 all 6 appeared together under the title Klavierübung. Klavier, of course, spelled with a C, which is very different from clavier spelled with a K. Let's look now at the toccata from the sixth Partita in more detail. From a formal and structural standpoint, it is clear that we are dealing with a very different conception compared to the 7 earlier toccatas. One aspect that has been retained is the alternation between improvisatory and fugal sections. However, this alternation has been more rationally organized within an overall ternary form. Thus, the piece commences with a freer, improvisatory-like section. We then move to a stricter section of imitative polyphony, and finally, we return to the freer, improvisatory-like opening material with some modifications, which concludes the piece. Moreover, the sections are thematically interrelated, and this provides a more immediate sense of unification compared to the earlier toccatas. Let's examine these thematic structures and interrelationships in a little more detail. The first section has 3 musical ideas, and let me demonstrate those. The first idea is obviously the one that begins the piece, and we have an arpeggiation followed by a chord. The second idea is somewhat similar in the sense that we still have some sort of an arpeggiation, but now it is filled in with more passage work. What I mean by this is that this is the second idea. Etc., etc. But if you look at this, it's still a chord, arpeggiated, but just filled in a little bit with more passage work. And most of these are really 7th chords, so etc. The third idea can really be divided into 2 separate ideas, let's say, but these tend to occur together, And what I mean by this is that we have an idea in the right hand, while at the same time the left hand plays this. But these, as I said, appear together. But sometimes what will happen is that these ideas are going to be reversed in the sense of which hand is playing them. So right after this, for example, we have this. In other words, now the role of the two hands has been reversed. What is going to happen with this first section is that when it returns, this third idea that I mentioned, in other words, etc., is not going to appear again. So when the first section returns, we are only going to have the first two ideas, and this is because this third idea that I just talked about is actually going to be used in the middle section. And of course, this is one example of motivic interrelationship between the sections. The middle section, the longest of the three, commences with an idea that is treated as a fugal subject, especially since it first appears on its own, and then a counter subject is added as the subject is taken up by the second voice. Let me demonstrate what I mean by this. Here is our main idea, and one could say the subject of this. And now here is going to come the second voice with the subject. Etc. And there's going to be one more voice, so we have three voices in total, although throughout this middle section a lot of times we only really have two voices going on. Incidentally, the descending interval of a second that we see in the beginning of the subject can be traced to a similar descending second that we hear in the first musical idea of the first section. What I mean by this is that we have this. So this second, if you remember, the piece started. So this is related to. And this is yet another example of the motivic interrelationships between the sections. I would like to offer a few interpretive suggestions, which are mainly based on two premises. First, that Baroque scores are not meant to be interpreted literally. And second, that Bach tended to include more information in his scores than the average Baroque composer. By more information, I mean that in places where other composers would have presented a simpler musical line and then let the performer fill in some of the ornamental details, Bach would frequently write in many of these details. This, in turn, can mean, always depending on the context and on which particular piece we're dealing with, that there may be a little less leeway in adding extra information to a Bach score. At the same time, it is important to keep in mind that the first premise I mentioned still applies. In other words, following Baroque conventions and not interpreting the actual notation literally especially in terms of rhythmic values. So keeping these in mind, let me offer you a few interpretive suggestions. The first suggestion I would like to make concerns the first idea of the first section, in other words this, and specifically I'm looking at this upward arpeggiation, and the way this is notated is a 16th note followed by 32nd notes. What happens here, first of all, I don't think we should interpret these rhythmic values literally. In other words, what I do is, yes, I may linger a little bit more on the first note, but then I kind of imagine the rest of the notes kind of accelerating towards the top note. So it's not so much this, but rather something like that. The other thing I would say here has to do with the fact that since this is an actual chord, the question is, should we hold down all the notes or not? Now, as I mentioned, the way Bach has it written is that nothing is held. In other words, if I were to interpret this literally, it would be like this. And to me, this sounds a little dry. Now, I have also heard several performances where you have the performer is going to hold down all the notes, which also makes sense. I think this does make sense. However, I suspect that Bach could have tried to indicate something like this had he really wanted to. Now, obviously, I'm not there to ask him, but what I would say, my suggestion would be to kind of adopt a middle ground, which is going to be a more flexible approach as well. What I mean by this is that what I try to do is keep down the notes, but I don't keep them all the way to the end to do this. On the other hand, I also don't do this, but rather something in the middle, and I'm going to kind of do it first of all in slow motion. So I'm holding the notes down beyond their rhythmic value, but not all the way to the end. Something like that. The benefit, I would say, of this approach is that I can vary it a little bit more. In other words, I decide, depending on the chord and what its expressive potential, let's say, can be, I can decide to keep the notes down a little more to the point where it sounds as if I'm pretty much holding them down all the way. But other chords that I think are a little more regular, let's say, I can be a little faster with letting go of the notes and making it approach a little bit more what we actually see in the notation. So, as I mentioned, my approach would be to kind of keep this middle ground and then be flexible with that middle ground. The second suggestion has to do with the second idea, in other words, this one. Here what we have in terms of notation is just 16th notes. So if I were to play this literally, etc. So here what I try to do is something a little similar to the previous idea, where I certainly am going to keep down the first note and linger a little bit on it, except perhaps not as much as I lingered on the first note of the first idea. And then again, depending on the chord, I can keep some notes down a little bit more. Again, I did it a little more slowly, but I hope that you notice that even the first note, I don't always hold it down as long. So depending on where I am in the piece, depending on the context, and obviously depending on my mood at that particular moment that I perform it, I hold some of those first notes a little more than others. So once again, first of all, I don't interpret the notation literally, but my non-literal interpretation is also flexible, meaning that I change it depending on the context and depending, of course, on my own mood at that particular moment when I'm performing the piece. Also, because this section is meant to be improvisatory, I try to also adopt a flexible tempo overall. So, in other words, I could do something like this. Now, when I get to the second idea, I may start a little more slowly and then accelerate. When I come back to the first idea, this one, I return back to my original tempo. But when I was playing the second idea, at least for that particular moment, I wanted to accelerate a little bit. So there are all sorts of rhythmic flexibilities that you can do in this section. I think this is perfectly justified because it is kind of an improvisatory section. Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the subject of the second section. In other words, this fugal subject that starts the second section. And I missed the second trill a little bit. It starts from the upper note. Now, what I wanted to talk about in terms of the subject has to do with these trills. So basically, the second note, for each one of those second notes, we have a trill. Etc. Now, when the second voice appears, we also have trills. Etc. Now, what is interesting is that what happens after these two voices, because after that, the trills start appearing irregularly. In other words, we don't get them as much. The third voice, for instance, if I were to look at exactly what happens in the score, we have something like this. In other words, Bach has notated a trill only in the third of those ideas. So the question is, should we be interpreting this literally? In other words, should we play trills only when Bach has notated them? Now, most performances that I know of, and my previous approach, in other words, when I had played the piece in the past, was to say, okay, this is my subject, etc. And this means that every time it appears, I'm going to play a trill. There are a couple of places where that becomes really difficult to do, but for the most part, you can actually play the entire second section, and every time this subject comes back, you can actually put a trill there. And there is a logic to this in the sense that in following Baroque conventions, certain things can be implied, and one could convincingly, I would say, argue that Bach, like other performers, has shown us what to do at first, and then he thinks, okay, well, you've seen what I've done in the beginning. I don't need to mark every other trill that appears. You see what happens, and then every time a similar passage occurs, you simply, as a performer, put a trill there like we did in the beginning. Now, this makes sense, but in this particular context, I'm not convinced that it makes 100% sense. And this is because, as I previously mentioned, it's not that Bach stops notating trills. He notates them just a little less regularly. And to me, this may mean that perhaps what he has in mind is that he doesn't want this subject to always have a trill associated with it. Now, why would he do this? For one thing, perhaps it's because we also had it here. In other words, we already have had the subject, this descending second, without a trill. And what happens is that if you were to continue playing through the section, and of course you're going to hear this when you listen to the performance and also follow the score, there are places where instead of one voice having this or this kind of idea, we also have things like this. And then the question is, well, okay, I can do or something like that, depending on the context. In other words, I can decide which of the two voices is really the one that should have a trill, and then I can do that. But there are places where this is not really possible. In other words, we have kind of a duet, let's say, of voices having the same kind of idea. So it seems to me that perhaps not adding trills everywhere may be a good solution. And what I have tried to do, again, this is not, I am not suggesting that one should not add trills, but this is something I had done in the past. I tried to put trills everywhere, and I wanted to approach this piece this time, in this case at least, taking the notation, or at least taking the notation of the trills, a little more literally, and see what I could do with that expressively. There are quite a few things that you can do. As I said, if I don't have to worry about or do something like that, I can make a really nice tapering off sound by holding the notes instead of something like that. So I can do these nice little diminuendos every time this double idea appears, let's say, because I don't have to worry about doing trills at that moment. And in general, I think I may have added, I don't remember exactly what I did in the particular performance, I may have added a couple of trills, but for the most part, I tried to follow what Bach has notated in terms of trills and play them only where they appear with, as I mentioned, a couple of exceptions. I would say this is something that is worth exploring. As I mentioned, most performances don't do that, but I would suggest that after listening to my performance, try it out and see what you think. To me, at least, it gave the piece a slightly different expressive flavor that I like. So this is why I decided to record it this way. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.